So, lately I've been having trouble remembering that Ruby exists. Before anyone gets worried, this doesn't spell doom for Dream Machine, and as I stated in that community post, Act 2 will probably be released sometime in the next couple weeks. But just in general, I've been growing notably less interested in talking about Ruby over the past few months. Every time I try to write a new Ruby video script, it feels more and more like a waste of time. Which doesn't make sense, realistically. My Ruby videos are still the most viewed videos on this channel, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. And yet, for some reason, making them feels like working with a dead franchise that no one cares about anymore. I think it's probably just a projection of how I personally feel. Recently, I watched Judgmental Critter's giant 2-hour review of RWBY Volume 9, which is very well made. If I had known it was going to be so in-depth, I wouldn't have even bothered attempting to watch Volume 9 myself. I would have just waited for the review video. If you want to check it out, there's a link in the description. Anyway, watching that helped me work through my feelings about Volume 9, and finally come to a conclusion. Basically, the bar is in hell. I don't mean to throw any shade at people who genuinely enjoyed the volume, or at least appreciated it despite its flaws, but I can't help but notice that the flaws are still as huge and as numerous as they've always been, and the fact that some parts of the volume were done better than usual isn't enough to make me ignore the rest. After years and years, we're still stuck at a point where even the stuff in RWBY that's done legitimately well is dragged down by all the stupid reasoning, inconsistent characterization, and overall poor storytelling surrounding it. And you know, I'm getting tired of pretending that I could ignore it. I'm tired of the expectation that it's only fair for me to try to enjoy certain parts of this show in a vacuum, that even though 90% of it ranges from solidly mediocre to flat out bad, the remaining 10% should make the experience worth my time. I don't think it does. For instance, I just find it hard to care that RWBY finally got some character development after a full decade, when it required the rest of her team, including the sister who raised her, to act completely oblivious to her suffering all volume, and to repeatedly prioritize John's feelings over hers. And this long overdue character arc, if you could even call it that, ended with RWBY magically deciding that she's fine exactly the way she is, without even bothering to reflect on her past actions in any meaningful way. Not to mention the honestly offensive suicide messaging that is inextricably linked to this plot point. There are lots of individual creative decisions in this subplot that you can enjoy, yes, but overall it's still very poorly written and clearly wasn't given any revisions to fine-tune it into an impactful or believable story. I can't give praise to something like this just because I'm happy the writers finally remembered to pay attention to their main character. Like, are we really at a point, as a fandom, where we have to celebrate the bare minimum? Has the bar for RWBY's writing truly fallen this low? And then there's the far more important question. Why are we still twisting ourselves in knots to find the good points in a franchise that just forces its visual artists, voice actors, and musicians to work themselves to the bone, trying to make up for the fact that its writers clearly don't care about their jobs anymore? If I have to do more work than the actual showrunners to convince myself to stay invested in this story, then after 7 years in this fandom, it's really no wonder that I'm just too tired to continue. After 7 years of being disappointed at every turn, I think I'm getting to the point where I associate the RWBY franchise itself with disappointment. And at this rate, unless some miracle happens, it's possible that by next year I won't even be talking about it anymore. In conclusion, I have maybe a year of motivation left to do all the RWBY stuff I want to do. Motivation that's already wearing thin right here and now. The clock is ticking. So with that in mind, I've been thinking, hey, what if I do what I usually do and make up an original concept directly inspired by this content, to at least keep myself engaging with it for the sake of inspiration? I mean, even if it doesn't work out, I'll have a shiny new world to play with for a while that maybe the people following me for RWBY might be interested in. Plus, it'll force me to finally start talking about my own characters and ideas on this channel. Which brings me to the creation of Ladybird. Like RWBY, it's a story starring 4 girls in red, white, black, and yellow, who fight crazy monsters with crazy weapons. That is pretty much where the similarities end, but to me those are the most important ones. I think the aesthetic of early RWBY was one of the things that people loved most about it, and the main reason why 90% of RWBY adaptations and crossovers don't stray beyond the Beacon era. Not only was the story simpler, but the mere concept of the story was simpler and easier to play around with. 4 cute girls have fun interactions at monster hunting school, Every once in a while, they leave school, get into an insane battle, and then go home. Rinse and repeat. Each girl has a brightly colored high-contrast design, and a familiar personality archetype for you to connect with. There's the prissy princess, the moody goth girl, the funny big sister, and the slightly awkward yet optimistic MC. With this simple setting and these simple characters, you can tell an endless amount of entertaining, easy-to-digest stories with minimal effort. So, recreating that aesthetic was my first priority. Bright, striking colors, an engaging art style, a simple setup, and simple characters that are easy to understand, at least on a surface level. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at what Ladybird actually is. Like Remnant, this is a post-apocalyptic world overrun by monsters. Whether it's actually supposed to be Earth or not, I haven't decided, but its people are called humans, and in the relatively recent past they brought their civilization to the brink of destruction through a general disregard for the health of the natural world and the value of human life, all in an endless, greedy pursuit of the fictional currencies they made up for themselves. Which I'm sure sounds totally absurd and unbelievable to all you listening out there. So, the gods of this world come down from the heavens to see how their creation is doing, and they take one look at all of this and go, well, this sucks, and come to the conclusion that humanity was a failed experiment that should no longer exist. You know, kind of like what the brother gods did to Remnant. Only in this instance, it's for a more obvious reason that actually makes sense, and will continue to be discussed thematically throughout the rest of the story. Anyway, the gods decide to punish humanity with a slow death, cursing the people they deemed the most destructive to have their bodies painfully dissolved into creatures called scales. These creatures are born in a mobile form called a crawler, which seeks out the souls of other human beings and attacks them in groups, latching onto their skin and quickly growing into their scale form, covering the victim in impenetrable armor that generally prevents them from being rescued until it's far too late. Some of them stop there, injecting the victim with digestive juices and slowly feeding on them until nothing is left. But others use their victims as scaffolds, creating gigantic armored beasts that can destroy vehicles and buildings to draw more victims out of hiding. Active scales don't live as long as sedentary ones, but they're a lot more deadly. Once this nightmarish scenario was set up, most of the gods of this world just peaced out, leaving the humans to their fate. But one minor god had the idea that humanity could be salvaged somehow, and managed to ally themselves with 3 other gods to help it survive until they could figure something out. This minor god is called the Veneration, or Ven for short, and they're basically the 5th main character in the story. They are solely responsible for the creation of the Ladybirds, people granted supernatural powers and the ability to use their own blood as a weapon to fight against the Scales. Throughout the plot, it is occasionally implied that the Ladybirds have greater significance and/or a secret secondary purpose, but we won't talk about that today. Anyway, there are thousands of Ladybirds across the globe, each one handpicked by the Veneration and tasked with protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The main characters are 4 such Ladybirds, who travel together and form a lasting friendship. I'll start by introducing Maeve, the oldest member of the group and the most experienced Ladybird. She also happens to be the older sister of Nell, the main character, who I'll talk about a little later. Maeve has a very harsh personality. I see her as the kind of character who always looks and sounds like she's about to boil over with rage. Despite that, she's more of a pragmatist than a pessimist, and not afraid to show the soft side of her personality if that's what's needed most in the moment. Before the start of the story, she and Nell lived together with their family in a farming community. Unfortunately, due to her albinism, Maeve wasn't able to spend long hours working in the sun with everyone else, and spent most of her childhood feeling isolated and useless. Against her parents' wishes, she ran away from home to become a Ladybird, hoping it would make her health issues more manageable and give her life some meaning. In the present day, she learns that her sister has recently become a Ladybird and an orphan, and decides to finally reunite with her and become her mentor. Over time, she learns to be a good big sister. Next up is Weaver, the sunshine of the group. She's friendly and cheerful, someone who excels at making friends and turning enemies into allies. She also has a bit of a dark past, which ties directly into the main plot later on. As it happens, not all Ladybirds use their powers for heroics. Weaver originally belonged to a gang of street children who made their living as thieves, and after she became a Ladybird, she started out using her abilities to make their robberies easier. They usually traded in scale shards, the most common energy source of the current world, an incredibly powerful and volatile substance. And unfortunately, one day one of their improperly stored stashes caught fire, resulting in a huge explosion that killed dozens and burned down a whole city block. Weaver and the few of her friends that survived became wanted criminals, and Weaver herself, as the most recognizable, decided it would be best if she went off on her own. In the present day, Weaver has successfully left her past behind and has been working as a normal Ladybird for several years now, as a trusted ally to both Maeve and Harmony. Harmony is the group tactician, a serious yet shy and generally soft-spoken person. She's also the most recent generation of a long line of Ladybirds, including her grandmother, who became one of the very first, after surviving the initial apocalypse that wiped out 90% of the human population. This relatively long family history is the reason for her collection of zombie tech, a nickname given to old technology that's been outfitted with modern scale-shard power sources. This collection includes the headphones she wears all the time, and a smartphone containing a variety of useful homemade applications, including one she uses to literally communicate with God. The Veneration usually appears to give the girls advice or join them on a mission after being summoned by Harmony's phone. In the present day, Harmony joins Weaver and Maeve in helping Nell learn how to live as a Ladybird, and since Nell is a little closer to Harmony's age and shares more personality traits, these two gradually form an especially close friendship. Last but not least, it's time to talk about Nell, our main character, whose journey as a new Ladybird forms the backbone of the story. A few years before this, the farming community where she used to live was decimated by a scale attack, and she and the other surviving children were given shelter in a boarding school in a nearby city. Basically, the Ladybird capital of the world. I'll probably explain the cities and more complex world building in a future video, but all you need to know right now is that Nell had to spend a long time processing the trauma of losing her home and family while essentially surrounded by propaganda. And after a close friend of hers decides to leave school and become a Ladybird, she starts to feel powerless, alone, and abandoned by the world, which eventually motivates her to become a Ladybird as well. She admits that she basically signed up to become a child super soldier out of peer pressure, which is initially a point of contention between her and Maeve, who doesn't like to see her last living relative putting her life at risk. But Nell is determined to make the most of her decision, and eventually finds fulfillment in helping others and learning from her new teammates. Although being a Ladybird isn't easy, she genuinely enjoys having the power to change the world around her. And front and center in this journey of self-worth is her relationship with the Veneration, who spends most of the story acting as a pillar of support and genuine encouragement for her. In turn, Nell goes out of her way to care for them and try to understand them, despite the fact that they're a god and they don't really feel they need any special attention. Eventually, though, when the Ladybirds and the Four Gods end up on opposing sides of the final conflict, it's those past moments of bonding and mutual trust that make it possible for them to reach a conclusion. It probably shows by now that, even though I haven't really written the story of Ladybird, I've already worked out its basic plot, including the ending, and a lot of its mechanics, themes, and world building. And in case the cursed production process of RWBY has disillusioned some of you out there, this is the kind of preparation you're supposed to do before you even think about pitching a series, let alone before it starts production. Making up the plot as you go and using your characters as mouthpieces to justify it usually does not work in the long run. Your story will mean more to the audience when it's clear that you have something you actually intend to accomplish with it. So before I end this video, I'd like to point out the biggest fundamental difference between this story and the one that inspired it. Ladybird is a story about love. About loving your friends, your family, the world in which you live, and learning to love yourself. Each character is motivated by something they care about very deeply, even the antagonists, and their actions in the story are meant to showcase this every step of the way. Now, am I trying to say that RWBY is a franchise devoid of love? Not exactly. What I am saying is that love is rarely factored into the decisions the characters make on their adventure, and the longer it goes on, the more obvious this becomes. They constantly act as if they don't care about anything but the vague plot propelling them forward, and it's one of the things that hurts the franchise the most. For example, and I hope you'll forgive me for going on another rant here, RWBY and Friends' behavior in Volume 8 was honestly appalling to me. I'm not even going to talk about their treatment of Ironwood, that's secondary. What bothered me the most is the way they behave towards the people they claim they want to save. In case you don't remember, their decision was to keep both Atlas and Mantle in the path of an apocalyptic Grimm attack, call out to other kingdoms for help, and fight to protect everyone until reinforcements arrive. And that last part is the most important, because it would be the only way to keep people safe in this situation they created. It should be the task they're most motivated for, the central conflict of the volume. Fighting to protect people from Grimm is their literal job. But instead, half the team makes the distress call and then sits around in Weiss's house watching the fight from a distance, and the other half of the team grudgingly helps protect people for only one episode. They don't look stressed about the chaos, they don't look injured and exhausted from their efforts, they just look bored and annoyed and like they don't want to be here. And fortunately for them, their only plot-relevant friend gets kidnapped by the villains, so they have a convenient excuse to bail out. Leaving us with a situation that, again, the heroes created, but none of them help with for most of the volume. They leave what should be their primary objective in the hands of minor characters and the military they demonize throughout the plot. Then, at the end of the volume, they decide to solve their problem by sending thousands of refugees to the most dangerous place in the world by several metrics. Why? Because that's where they want to go next. Heaven forbid they actually consider the safety of the innocent people under their care. And even in Volume 9, they never once show concern for the people they dumped into that Grimm-infested desert wasteland, or the people who never even made it to the desert wasteland because they fell into the void and died. A whole volume supposedly based on themes of introspection, and our heroes can't be bothered to think about the fact that they have multiple layers of blood on their hands. The only person who even comes close to addressing this topic is a villain, who just wants to psychologically torment the protagonist, not to get her to accept the responsibilities that should be part of her job description. And I look at all this, and I look at these characters, and I can't help but think, where is your love? Where is your passion? Where is your drive to help others? Being a hero is about more than waving a fancy weapon around and making speeches in front of the bad guys. It's about loving your community and your world enough to put your own life on the line to protect it. When you love something, you don't sit idly by watching it be destroyed while wondering why someone else isn't coming to help. You don't find yourself separated from it in its darkest hour and ignore it completely to instead wallow in self-pity. A hero should love the world they want to save, and if RWBY's story won't acknowledge this, then I want to write a story that does. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. At this point in time, my plans for Ladybird's story are basically just talking about it more in videos, presenting the characters and the story, and maybe doing a little animation here and there. If that sounds cool to you, I hope you'll look forward to learning more about it in the future. Like, subscribe, whatever, and I'll see you next time.